I want to thank you, President Blackaby and Dean Booth, for the invitation to be here. It's an honour to be at the Canadian Baptist Theological Seminary and College. I haven't been in Canada since 1999, and that was in the yucky part, Toronto. I've had the pleasure of going out to Regent College and being in British Columbia. It's great to be here as well. And I'm glad I arrived this week rather than last week. It was 30 degrees Celsius when I left Brisbane. So this is quite the juxtaposition of weather. But I have to say, it was worth it just for the flight from Vancouver to Calgary, the flight over the Rocky Mountains. That alone was worth the journey. That was a great, beautiful thing to behold, and I've really enjoyed my time here so far with all the good folks committed to training men and women for ministry in a complex and changing world. And yeah, my thing these days is political theology. I have wide-ranging interests. I'm kind of easily distracted. I'll do a little bit of historical Jesus, the Apostle Paul, a bit of the Apostolic Fathers, maybe a bit of Septuagint or textual criticism. But I got into political theology out of confusion and despair, would be to put it mildly. Australia has been through the same sort of political convulsions and cultural upheavals as you've experienced in Canada. And back in 2016, we had some, very, very big and animated discussions about same-sex marriage, should it be legalized and become law. And there was a Catholic bishop called Julian Porteous in Tasmania, in the city of Hobart, who produced a pamphlet that was very pastoral, very mild, nothing polemical or antagonistic about it. But it was explaining the Catholic Church's view of marriage and their opposition to same-sex marriage. And the bishop was defending what was the current law at the time. And there was nothing really terrible about this book. But an LGBT activist complained about the book and lodged a claim with the Human Rights Commissioner, and the Human Rights Commissioner said the Archbishop had a case to answer. And that confused me because it meant you had a Catholic bishop who was being hauled before a government tribunal because he did, with apparent heinousness and malice of forethought, did conspire to teach Catholic beliefs to Catholics. Which kind of baffled me why this would be illegal. I could understand people like criticizing him or, calling him names or things, but to be hauled for a government tribunal for that was a bit odd. Now, the claimant dropped the claim because it wasn't expedient because of the incoming election. But there was a series of other things that happened. A CEO of a football club was sacked because he refused to resign from his church. He was told either resign from his church or resign from his job, and he chose to resign from his job. Now, that was a more complex thing that played out, and eventually the club had to concede that they did wrong. Even more recently in Australia, a local territory government was very alarmed that there is a Catholic hospital that doesn't perform abortions or euthanasia, so the territory government just seized the hospital. They rushed through legislation so they could seize the hospital. And there were two things that were chilling about it. The legislation said that the police authorities were entitled to use reasonable force to take control of the hospital if the Catholics put up a fight or protest. And then what was even also chilling is a couple of days after they went through, there was a few appeals in courts, but it didn't seem to work. They took control of the hospital on the Friday, and on the Sunday, not on the Monday, on the Sunday, they sent in a work crew to take down the cross on top of the hospital. Paid them double time on a Sunday. Tradesmen are pretty expensive on Sunday. And they did that while Catholics are at worship. And it looked like a scene from Beijing, where governments were dismantling a church or taking down a cross. And it was normalizing the act of taking punitive action against religious groups. Now, I know Canada has not been immune to similar things. I don't know whether you know this, but 100 Catholic churches have been burned down in the last 5 years. Trinity Western University lost a major court case about whether it can insist that its students at the law school be required to follow Christian principles in life and conduct. So this is something that's happening all around the world. Now then we can add to this wonderful dumpster fire of culture wars. We now have the rise both of Christian nationalism, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. And we also have progressive governments acting somewhat more authoritarian in a predacious and punitive way to religious communities that don't toe the line with the latest zeitgeist, the latest spirit of the age. And then we've got war in Ukraine, the potential for war in Taiwan. We can see the horrible things, the carnage and the violence happening in Israel and Gaza. And we could go on to the various things going on, the various dictatorships that are propping up around the world, against all sorts of Christian groups, the continuation of Islamic terrorism and the like. And it was at this point I spoke to a friend, an author, N.T. Wright, and said, what's the word of wisdom for this age? What do we need to say to Christians in an age of, literally a totalitarian terror and dysfunctional democracy? And this is a book that we thought was very important. I mean, a lot of books are written about politics these days. I think every man and his dog is now writing a book about Trump. Like, I once walked the dog for Trump's second cousin twice removed. I'll tell you everything I learned about Trump's dog and what Trump's dog tells you about Trump. Every man and his dog is writing books about Trump. I don't know. And a lot of people are writing books about Christianity and politics. And what I find is everyone's writing about the Trump phenomena and Roe v. Wade in the American context. Which is fair enough, because they're the kind of the big issues in front of people's face, and they do have kind of global consequences. But we want to suggest, there's actually more happening in the world than just what happens between Fox News and MSNBC. There's a bit more going on. Think about the Christians in Myanmar under a military dictatorship. Think about Christians in Ukraine, Christians in Taiwan. Think about the different complexities of being a Christian in India or Indonesia. Okay, everyone's facing their own difficulties of how we be loyal, faithful Christians, faithful to Christ, advance the kingdom, whether you're living in an Islamic country, a liberal democracy, or you're living in a kind of very fluid and fractious Latin American country, Argentina, Brazil, or something. There's different problems going on everywhere, and we don't want to view this just through the lens of the North American context. Okay, so we need to have a more global and informed view of how we think about political theology, because what Romans 13 means in either Alabama or Alberta, maybe it needs to be informed about what it means in Nigeria and Norway, as we take a global perspective to be faithful citizens of the kingdom of God. So in these lectures, I'm going to try to spell out, how do Christians relate to the state? What kind of politics, what type of government should we support? I'm not going to give clear answers that you should definitely vote for one party or another. I'm not going to be partisan in what I try to do. I'm not going to say this party has God on their side, or this party was spawned from the armpit of Satan, or anything like that. But I'm going to give us some, hopefully for all of us, some advice, some guidance, some proposals on how we can be citizens of both the kingdom as we labor to build for the kingdom in this day and age. So in my first lecture, we're going to look at the book of Romans. Now, what's been a bit of a trend, certainly I think about the 1990s and following, is to read Paul as a counter-imperial figure. So Paul was kind of against the Roman Empire. He was kind of a bit of, Jesus gone in a Che Guevara direction, if you like. He was a subversive agent. People, they love the word subversion. The word subversion is a diction you find everywhere. Paul was always subversive. He's a subversive figure. We love subversive figures. And Paul's a very anti-Roman figure. What's really funny is the anti-imperial Paul, I notice, becomes more popular when there's a Republican in the White House. Okay, so I remember as soon as Donald Trump got elected, I thought, well, the anti-imperial Paul will be making a bit of a comeback. During the Obama years, it's like, yeah, church and state can get along, Yes, we can do that. Christendom wasn't that bad. And then once Trump's back in, it's no, separation of church and state. Paul was bringing down the Roman Empire. But I have to say at one level, I do think there is something to the anti-imperial Paul. The language of gospel, Lord, Saviour, these are not technical religious terms. These are terms that could be used as part of Roman propaganda. They could be used in ancient literature, in inscriptions, and the various writings that were part of the cultural encyclopedia of the world around the first Christians, the one they inhabited. And, as early as the early 20th century, the great German linguist and historian Adolf Deissmann, he argued that when Paul used the language of Jesus as Lord, Saviour, and the gospel, the announcement of his lordship, he says there was at least a silent protest against the paraphernalia of Roman power. And for many then, Paul's gospel does have a kind of anti-imperial feel for it, simply by virtue of having a gospel about another Lord. In fact, N.T. Wright says this, he says, "At every point, therefore, we should expect what we in fact find, that for Paul, Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not." Similar to Tom is someone else cut from a different cloth, John Dominic Cross and Jonathan Reed, who said, to proclaim Jesus as Son of God was deliberately denying Jesus the highest title. Now, I can think of a number of very good examples that would seem to support this. One of my favorite comes from Acts 17, when Paul and his entourage arrive in Thessalonica. And, the local Jews there are kind of a little bit alarmed about Paul and his friends arriving, and they acclaim that these men have caused trouble all over the world, and they have now come here. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. Now, that would imply that the announcement that Jesus was Lord and King was at some level either a challenge, a repudiation of Caesar, or at least made the local authorities a little bit uncomfortable. It may have not been like a full-on insurrection, but it was certainly considered an affront to the majesty of the Roman Empire and the Roman people. The other thing we have to remember, why did the Romans persecute Christians? Ever wondered? Do you think they persecuted Christians because they said Jesus is Lord of my heart? That they could not give a flying fajita who was Lord of your heart. What they wanted to know is who you recognized as Lord of all. And on that note, the Christians were very resolute in saying Jesus is Lord of all. Now, they weren't always trying to be subversive against the emperor. I think a lot of the time Christians were just trying to live under the radar, live faithfully without being noticed. And in some cases, certainly in the 2nd century, they could say, look, we're happy to pray for the emperor, we're not just going to pray to him. And they put themselves up as some of the best examples of citizens in the empire. So it wasn't all kind of, planning coups and waiting for God to overthrow them. They wanted to live within the empire with some peace. Yet there was inescapably an element where they could say our obedience to the emperor can only ever go so far. And we believe that the emperor is at best an instrumental power, not the ultimate power. Third, we could also point to some things in the reception history. As Christians interacted with Roman authorities, it became very apparent that they were not willing to compromise their faith or their worship or their singular and focused devotion to Jesus in order to be regarded as faithful citizens. And one of the ways to weed out Christians was to get them to offering sacrifices to the gods, or in particular, sacrifices to an image of the emperor. And there's one famous story. This is fantastic. I don't know whether you ever read the Martyrdom of Polycarp, but you really should read the Martyrdom of Polycarp. I know there's a lot of good books out there. The Case for the Purpose-Driven, Best Life Now, Prayer of Jabez Diet. Now, I know that's a great book, but rather than read that, I ask you to go and read the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And Polycarp is brought before the arena. He's given an ultimatum: either worship the emperor or you're going to be killed. And he says, for 86 years I have served my Lord, and he has done me no wrong. How can I deny my king who saved me? Okay. that was the genuine attitude. I mean, Polycarp actually recognized that the magistrate, the governor, had authority, and he was happy to obey him in the matters for which he deserved our obedience, but he was not going to offer worship which was idolatrous. And that's why I love it. There's one text called the Acts of Paul, and it's quite an amazing story where the Emperor Nero, this is like a 2nd century, this is fictitious, the Emperor Nero finds out that his servant Patroclus has died and been brought back to life by the Apostle Paul. And Nero greets his newly resuscitated servant. But then he's not terribly keen on what Patroclus says. He came in and Patroclus cries out to Patroclus, you are alive. And Patroclus answers, I am alive, Caesar. And he said, who is it that made you alive? And the boy, lifted up by the confidence of faith, said, Christ Jesus, the King of ages. And the Emperor Nero asked in dismay, is he to be King of ages and destroy all kingdoms? Patroclus said to him, yes, he destroys all kingdoms under heaven, and he alone shall remain in eternity, and there will be no kingdom which escapes him. And he struck his face and cried out, Patroclus, are you also fighting for that king? He answered, yes, my lord and Caesar, for he has raised me from the dead. And Barsabas Justus the flat-footed, great name for someone, and Urian the Cappadocian and Festus of Galatia, the chief advisors to Nero, they said, and we too fight for him, the King of ages. And after tortured those men whom he used to love, he imprisoned them and ordered that the soldiers of the great king be sought out, and he issued an edict that all Christians and soldiers of Christ should be executed. So I mean that story is a great parable of the tension between Christians and the Roman state. At the same time, while there is something to be said for the anti-imperial reading of Paul, there is the danger that we think that Paul was a type of political activist, as if Paul was running around Rome with a sign saying hashtag down with Caesar, hashtag slave lives matter, or something that we turn Paul into the prototypical social activist concerned with a whole bunch of things that may not have been obvious or his radar, as if religion was simply instrumental to Paul's own political campaign. The first thing we have to note is that most of Paul's letters are dealing with things we would call religion. Do Gentiles have to convert to Judaism in order to be followers of Christ? Dealing with controversies about worship, about food sacrifice to idols, talking about money and the like, and about his own missionary endeavors, and getting the Romans to support him as he goes out to Spain. Indeed, in terms of a ratio, the word God compared to the word Caesar, it's like a 30-to-1 ratio. So Caesar doesn't get that many mentions in the New Testament, and it's not exactly like the New Testament is a complete manifesto. Secondly, again, as I said before, anti-imperial readings seem to become very trendy and in vogue in certain political seasons, which makes me think maybe it's our own political seasons rather than Paul's is potentially driving the anti-imperial motifs in Paul's thought. And then third, we've also got to note that the experience of empire varied around the empire. Living in Rome was one thing, living in Greece was another, Asia Minor, or in some of the client kingdoms like Armenia or Judea or Egypt. Some of these were ruled as senatorial provinces, some were ruled directly by the emperor and his entourage. In many places, the locals were very keen to ingratiate themselves to the empire, enjoy the patronage and the benefits it construed upon them. Not everyone was unhappy about living in the Roman Empire. A lot of people liked it. It was better than anarchy. It was better than being dominated and conquered by these foreign barbarian tribes. It was better than the infighting of an oligarchy. It made worldwide travel. There are a lot of benefits to being in the empire. And being in the empire would have varied experience depending on where you were on the various rungs of society. And there were some Christians who were able to make a livable life within the empire. Fourth, we could also point out, as much as Paul's language of gospel, Lord, Saviour does resonate with imperial language and its usage in propaganda and poetry, a lot of it's also inherited simply from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And there it's taken up, not necessarily with any clear intention of being a political nuisance, being subversive or radical. And then, fifth, we might also want to remember, if Paul is such a political radical, how do you explain Romans 13, 1-7, where Paul says, clear as plain as day, Christians should submit to governing authorities? I mean, that's not something you would normally mention if you're planning a coup, a revolution, or getting ready for a change of government. That's the thing. So those are the factors. There seems to be a bit of a pro and con to it. Be that as it may, I think we can make the case in a qualified sense for an anti-imperial Paul. And I think we can see that through a reading of Paul's letter to a cluster of house churches located in Rome, none other than Paul's epistle to the Romans. This is an epistle that was written, I think, primarily to introduce Paul to the Roman house churches. I think Paul had a lot of friends, colleagues, supporters, fans already in Rome. But he also wants to assuage some reservations about him, clarify what his own views really are when there's a lot of people, I think, exaggerating Paul's view, making him sound he's a lot more anti-Torah, anti-law, or anti-Israel than he would ever want to imagine himself. And he wants to clarify things. I think he also is aware that the Roman house churches are potentially fractious and fragile, and they may experience some of the same debates and divisions that have happened in Antioch, Galatia, and Corinth. So he wants to do a bit of pastoral care. So he's kind of setting out his gospel and theological depth and hoping they'll also get behind him as he goes to Jerusalem to deliver the collection, and they'll also help him as he goes out to Spain for a further mission out in the far western regions of the empire. But when we read Romans, there are certain parts of it that do resonate with the anti-imperial reading. For a start, you've got the opening declaration of the gospel, Romans 1, 3-4, where Paul talks about the gospel that was pre-promised through the prophets about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, designated the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. That kind of a thing. Now, one Jewish political philosopher, Jacob Taubes, he said, from reading these words, this is what he said: I want to stress that this is a political declaration of war. When a letter introduced using these words and not others is sent to the congregation in Rome to be read out loud, one doesn't know into whose hands it will fall, and the censors weren't idiots. One could, after all, have introduced it pietistically, quietistically, neutrally, or however else. But there is none of that here. And this is why my thesis is that this is, in a sense, of the epistle to the Romans, is political theology, a political declaration of war on Caesar. This gospel that Paul announces is something of an analog, subversive analog, if you like, to the gospel of Caesar, that would herald the great triumphs and the great accolades Caesar deserved because he brought peace and prosperity to the empire. I mean, it's subversive, if you like, around imperial because of the language that's used. Gospel, Lord, Son of God, again, all things claimed of Caesar. And it's also making a very explicit messianic claim when Jesus is called, the Son of David, according to the flesh, and the Son of God according to the Spirit of holiness. Now, the Romans were aware in varying degrees of Jewish messianic hopes and the idea that there would one day be a ruler in the East who would liberate the Jewish people from the yoke of Roman domination. Tacitus referred to a prediction from Israel's sacred traditions about how at this time, this is like in the 60s or something of the first century, how at this very time the East was to grow powerful and rulers coming from Judea were to acquire a universal empire. Or another Roman historian, Suetonius, said, there had spread all over the East an old and established belief that it was fated at that time for men coming from Judea to rule the world. So the Romans knew about Jewish messianic expectations, and they were very keen to shut that down. They did not want to see that happen. They were very content. And the reasons the Romans ruled Judea is not because it was a great little cash cow making money of it. It may have even cost them money to station some troops in there. Judea was important because it was a land bridge between Egypt, which was the breadbasket, and Syria, which was the main trading post. So that's why it was very important. And the only thing between that and the desert and the Parthians and the Sassanids was a river called the Jordan. So it was a very important militaristic piece of real estate, and they were not going to give it up. The other thing we can note about Romans 1 is, Paul talks clearly about the salvation of God. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And this is for salvation for the Jew first and then for the Greek. And the idea of salvation was very big to the Roman people. I mean, they would even celebrate the salvation of the people of Rome, something that Augustus restored when he took full control of the empire. In fact, Horace, he was a Latin poet during the Augustan era, and he would do this really sycophantic poetry. He would say things like, "As long as Caesar is safe, who would fear the Parthian? Who would fear the frozen Scythian? Who would fear the swarms of savage Germany which they breed? Who would worry about war in Spain?" As long as Augustus is on the throne in Rome, the whole empire is wonderful and safe. The salvation of the Roman Empire is secured by Caesar. And in a sense, what I think Paul does, he sets up a contrast between the salvation of Caesar and the salvation of Israel's Messiah. And it comes down to really who is Lord of the world. Is it the Roman Caesar in Paul's day? I believe that's Claudius, and then it would be Nero. Or is it Jesus, the Son of God? Who is the real Lord of the world? And for me, what really seals the deal for the anti-imperial element to Paul's theology is not so much in Romans 1, it's when you get to Romans 15:12. Now, Romans 15, I think, is actually the climax of the letter. Sadly, a lot of people read Romans 1 to 8. That's good. Your good theology of salvation. Romans 9 to 11 is either about Calvinism or Israel in the end times. Then you got 2 verses of ethics in Romans 12, and then people just pretty much think the rest is the rolling credits, or some other. I don't know what's happening there. I mean, maybe some ethics, something about weak and strong, and the like. But Romans 15, I think, is probably the climax of the letter, particularly when Paul says, "Welcome one another as the Messiah welcomed you." And he really wants the Roman Christians, the house churches there, to be unified between Jews and Gentiles, irrespective of whether they are very strict or more liberal in their views of the Jewish Torah. And he sort of basks in the idea of Jews and Gentiles worshipping together. That seems to be the main point in chapter 15. But along those lines, he then pulls out a quote from Isaiah 11:10. And Paul says, someone in passing, and you probably would miss it if you blink, Paul says, "The root of Jesse will spring up, one who will arise to rule over the nations. In him the nations will hope." Now, the root of Jesse there is a messianic designation for a royal deliverer. I mean, the root of David is used. I think it's used in Jeremiah. It's used in the Qumran scrolls for a Messiah. And the rise of Israel's kingdom will be great because it will deliver it from its humiliation and subjugation from foreign powers like Rome. So this is explicit language saying, someone from the root of Jesse, from the Davidic line, is going to rise up and rule over the nations. But the Romans would say, whoa, hang on. We've got someone from the line of Caesar who's kind of ruling the nations. And that's kind of the status quo that we're rather keen on keeping. So that little quotation from Isaiah 11:10, I think is pregnant with a lot of political eschatology. Now, whether Paul believed it was his job to make that happen, I think that's another question. But Paul has no misapprehensions here. He's very clear. Eventually, the empire, the kingdom of the Messiah, is going to overthrow, eclipse, or simply just outlast the empire of Caesar. And, this was a major front because the Romans were very big on the idea of eternal Rome, that they had been appointed by the gods to rule the world. In Virgil's Aeneid, which is, one of the key texts for understanding Roman political culture, it said Rome could achieve sovereignty without limit, and there was the gift of the nations the gods had given to Caesar. And Virgil used his poetry to teach that the Romans will rule all of the earth's people. And this is a benefit to the earth because they will come under the patronage of the Roman people and their leaders. And this was achieved with the pacification of various peoples in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And, Roman power at its height in the late 1st, certainly early 2nd century, seemed to be at its very pinnacle. It seemed like the Romans were a juggernaut and they were unstoppable. Yet for Paul, that is merely the appearance. The reality is that there is another Lord of the world. And Paul quoted Isaiah 11:10 to say that. Or in the words of Warren Carter, he says, God's universal and inclusive sovereignty was worked out in inclusive, ethnically mixed communities that provided communal experiences and practices alternative to the empire's elite-dominated hierarchical and exclusionary societal structures. Paul sees the gospel from and about God and revealing God's sovereign purpose in Rome's very world. So in other words, the gospel means that eventually there's only going to be one Lord of the world still standing, and it won't be Caesar. Now, of course, saying all that, if there is a kind of implied counter-imperial rhetoric in Romans 1 and a very explicit counter-imperial rhetoric in Romans 15:12, then what do you do with Romans 13? Submit to governing authority. I mean, because that seems to be the very antithesis. That seems to imply cooperation, quietism, just going along, not getting involved in politics, that kind of thing. Because, Paul there talks about to submit to governing authorities, pay taxes, the government does not bear the sword in vain, that sort of thing. So what we are to make of that. We'll say a little bit more about the reception history of that text later. Let's make a few observations now about Romans 13, what that's got to do with this counter-imperial reading of Paul. The first thing we've got to notice about Romans 13 is it's dominated with God language. Okay, in about 7 short verses, it uses the word God some 6 times, the word theos. Paul says there is no authority except God. Okay, the powers, political, are appointed by God. Those who resist political authorities oppose the authority of God. Political authorities preserve social order with the sword are in effect agents of God. Political authorities are even called servants of God. Now, this is not a pure capitulation to the goodness of pagan power, if you like, but I think it's saying that in the very minimum, look, some government is better than no government, okay? So, I mean, in the ancient world, anarchy was a real thing, and that's a world where might makes right and the strong prey on the weak. So some government, no matter how idolatrous or corrupt, is better than no government. And in fact, God appoints government for that very purpose, to provide order. So government, in whatever form it is, Roman, Egyptian, Babylonian, some government is better than anything than the alternative, and God appoints government to govern wisely. The second thing we might want to note is to remember that what Paul says in Romans 1 and in Romans 15, invests Jesus with divine authority as Saviour and ruler in the world in a way that at some level does compete with the claims of Caesar. But those claims and counterclaims do not necessarily have to always make a direct beeline for each other for some sort of game of like Mortal Kombat or something like that. You can have two sort of competing empires that exist in parallel that don't immediately and always come into conflict. The other thing we've got to do is to read Romans 13 in light of Paul's apocalyptic narrative about the overthrow of all authorities and the return of Jesus. So Paul talks in Romans 13, 1-7 about how we relate to governing authorities. He also talks about how we can be good citizens in Rome, in Antioch, by maintaining the second half of the Ten Commandments. But then he's also got this little sort of eschatological, ethical exhortation, how we need to behave properly as we wait for the day of Christ. And that day of Christ is going to solve all the problems about good and bad government. So at one level, obeying government authorities is simply an interim solution, because ultimately, at the return of Christ, the problem of government is going to be solved. So on this view, Romans 13, 1-7 is still an affirmation of divine authority, God's authority. God appoints all government. Government is a good thing. It's to govern wisely. It's to administer the state, to administer justice. Christians should recognize that. And that's a better option than what's happening in Paul's day, when the seeds of revolution are being planted in Judea, and there's going to be an uprising that's going to have terrible effects for the Judeans there and for the Jewish people in general. So if an empire is kind of nearly just, we'll talk about this later, then it's worth obeying and worth giving respect to. But ultimately, it will be eclipsed, or it will be thrown down. And at the end of history, maybe Rome will be nothing more than a footnote in the story of the lordship of Christ. So then, what can we conclude about political theology, Romans, Christians, and empire? At one level, Romans is not a political manifesto. Like I said, it's largely a missional and pastoral document. It's pastoral theology, but albeit one not divorced from the socio-political realities of the Roman Mediterranean. Yet the universal vision of Paul's gospel, with its clear view of the ultimate revelation of the lordship of Christ, means there is a sometimes spoken or unspoken rivalry between Christ and Caesar. As William Ramsey once said, a universal Paulinism and a universal empire must either coalesce, or one will destroy the other. This rivalry cannot last forever. So let's not forget that Romans is bracketed by beginnings, a beginning that opens up with the confession of Jesus as Messiah and Lord, and ends with reference to him as one who rules over the nations. If that is the case, then Paul's letter to the Romans is delivered to the heart of the empire with a bold thesis that there is only one true Lord, Jesus Christ. And should a Roman official have read the letter would have appeared to be the ravings of a fanatical Eastern superstition, politically malicious at best, and perhaps superstitious and seditious at worst. But when I think of this as well, I often wonder, would Paul have written this if he knew what Nero was like? Because Paul is writing this when there's just been a bit of a change. Claudius has died, Nero is now in power, and the first few years of Nero's reign were pretty good. But I've always wondered, would Paul have written something different if he knew about the Nero's persecution of Christians? Or what would he have written if he knew about the Roman sacking of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple? It's hard to say, but I'll say this. Growing up, I had an aunt who had some lovely Labradors, beautiful Labradors, and one of the Labradors was called Nero. And there is actually a long British tradition of naming dogs after Roman emperors. It actually used to be very, very common, naming dogs after Roman emperors. Domitian or Aurelius or all these great names. It's very common to name dogs after Roman emperors. Now, I think it's kind of ironic in a sense, because the Roman emperor Nero, according to tradition, put Paul to death. He had Paul executed. Probably thought nothing of it. Nero had a lot of people killed, both Roman people in other places around the world. He kind of went a little bit crazy with maniacal power, our sources tell us. But Paul was executed by Nero, beheaded, and no one thought anything about it. And yet, here we are, 2,000 years later, we call our sons Paul and our dogs Nero. Something worth pondering. And then, my friend, that's the first lecture. In the next lecture, I want to talk a little bit more about Christians, how we relate to the empires of the world, and what it means to us as we look at a more contemporary setting about the challenges we face today. What does Romans 13, how do we read Romans 13 in the world today? So thank you very much. Now, do we have time for questions, or is there a plan? Okay, I think then now is a very good time for questions. definitely early in Nero's reign when Romans should be dated. So I think it's like 57, 58. I mean, that seems to be the consensus about when it was written. But it's a bit of those kind of like hypotheticals. You know, if Paul knew about, you know, how bad Nero would be, would he had a few more footnotes to Romans 13? The problem with Romans 13 is it offers a very clear exhortation to obey governing authorities. Okay, and it doesn't say, unless or except. We don't get the exceptions. We don't get the qualifications. Again, he's just basically saying, look, I think he's telling the Romans, look, stay under the radar. You know, be a small target, which in some cases is good advice for today. I think in different parts of the world, you don't want to advertise who you are and what you're doing. So yeah, I wish Paul had a few more qualifications. But we see the rest of Christian history, as they think about church and state, they're the ones who have got to think through Romans 13 and what are the exceptions when we say, well, we'll obey governing authorities to this point, or unless, or on the condition that. But yeah. Yeah, so the question is, to what degree does Paul's point of view come across as a variation of Pharisaism? Very interesting. I mean, the Pharisees were the set-apart ones, weren't they? And do you know how Paul begins Romans? He says, Paul, an apostle, and what does he say next? Set apart for the gospel. So I mean, this will blow people's minds, but Paul starts out as saying, I'm a Pharisee for Jesus. I am set apart for Jesus. I mean, that's a bit of a mind-blowing way to say it. Paul was from the Pharisaic tradition. Now, it was a little bit diverse. The Pharisees were kind of a socio-political interest group, and that's how they kind of started out at one point till they kind of lost favour with the Hasmoneans, and to some degree they became a little bit of they weren't the official leaders of Judaism in Judea. They were more like the unofficial leaders of Judea. So they were kind of like a minority movement, or like the People's Party to some degree. So when people wanted to know about law, life, you know, purity, hope, you know, everything from wills to inheritance to how to obey the Sabbath properly, they generally looked to the Pharisees. Not exclusively, but that they were very much the popular leaders of the Jewish people. And some of them were suspicious of all claims or the need to engage in violent revolution, but others were full on in favour of it. And you see this by a number of Pharisees who align themselves with the more zealous and militaristic wings of first century Judaism. I think Paul does carry some of that heritage with him. I think Paul was very anti-Gentile and anti-Hellenism. So he saw everything sort of Greek and Gentile as impure and idolatrous and immoral. Okay, and I mean, and you do get a little bit of that, like in Romans 1:18 to 32, which does play on a very stereotypical Jewish denunciation of all things Gentile, Greek, and pagan. So I think Paul kind of is still bringing that with him, but with his Pharisaic heritage, he definitely believes in a resurrection and a reordering of power, a reversal of all things. The difference is he's now put Jesus at the center of that and regarded Jesus rather than the Torah as, I think, the most defining thing for a renewed Israel. That's where I think the key difference is. But I think, yeah, Paul does bring a little bit of Pharisaism with him, even as a follower of Christ. I don't have the text of Romans 15:12 in front of me, but I'm pretty sure there's future tenses of the verb. Means the root of Jesse will rise to rule over. So I think it's looking towards the future. And Paul doesn't say, and we need to make it a reality. So you need your gospel tracts in one hand and a sword in the other, and we'll give the second coming a bit of a helping hand by getting rid of Caesar to pave the ground for Jesus. That's precisely the view I think Paul wants to avoid. Because I think Paul knows if you replace him, if you kill one Caesar, you just get another one. I mean, and this is an interesting. One of the questions I put to students, and I'll put it to you, would Paul rather be Nero's assassin or Nero's chaplain? If you had a choice, which would you rather be? Because if you're really big on separation of church and state, being his chaplain is not necessarily a great prospect. But then again, does Paul really think that armed revolution is the way to advance the kingdom? I don't think he believes that. I think Paul would be that. No, I don't think Paul would want to be singing, Laudes Imperi, like all hail the empire. But I don't think Paul was walking around Rome looking at the Palatine going, Sic semper tyrannis, stick it to the tyrant. I think Paul was very much between them. Although, based on Paul's conversation with other Roman officials, I think he'd probably take the chaplaincy role. Although he may not be in the role for very long. That would be, is what I imagine. Yeah. Yep, question at the back here. Yep, okay. The question is, what is the tension between, obeying governing authorities now, but Jesus being Lord in the future, but how does the future impact us in the present? Very good question. That's the one I think everyone is wrestling with. I think Paul is not, at this point, not imagining a day when Christians will become the majority within the state. He doesn't think they have a moose's chance in a blender of establishing a Christian nation anytime soon, because they're like just a little sect, or a superstitious cult to the Romans. So at their moment, their best option is survival, a way of living inside the Roman Empire. And you do find different authors. I mean, Luke does this a little bit, I think, trying to explain that Christians are not really a threat to the peace and security. We're not a threat to the justice of the Roman Empire. But one thing we will tell you, Roman justice is not very just from our perspective. So you do find very quickly people making apologies to the Romans to tolerate the Christians. That's Justin Martyr, that's Tertullian. So you do find Christians trying to make their way within the world that doesn't require an antagonistic relationship. But as much as they want to try and get the Romans to tolerate them, they're very quick to point out, look, we'll pray for you and that, but we're not going to kill for you, and we're not going to worship you, okay? And yet you still, every time there's an earthquake or a famine, you always blame us for it, because we haven't been praying to the gods. It wasn't us, we promise. So I think there is a kind of a tension there, but Christians were content to say it's going to be fixed in the final size. In the final act, that's when the despots, the dictators, the tyrants, the terrors are going to be dealt with fully and finally. What we can do is try either live under the radar or have the most amicable relationship we can with the state. Though in some cases you do see them not trying to bring, and this is what the tension, they're not necessarily trying to bring the state down, they're trying to set up an alternative to it, like an alternative society ordered by the story, the symbols, the mission message of Jesus. And that alone, when it becomes attractive to people, when they discover a new way of being human, that's where I think the real subversion is. When people say, you know what, I've looked at Christ, I've looked at Caesar, Christ looks, smells, and tastes a heck of a lot better. That's where I think the subversion comes in. I mean, there's a bunch of things. One of the debates is, did Paul think Jesus was going to return literally any day now? So there are some things in Paul that do give you the sense of he's expecting a very imminent return. Other places you think Paul's aware of it. Well, maybe it'll be a bit longer. There may be a few other things. I've got to have the man of lawlessness first and all that. So that's one debate. Does Paul think that Christ is coming imminently? So there's no point in trying to evangelize the entire. Just evangelize as many as you can, but don't expect to ever establish a Christendom or anything remotely like that. I don't think that was on Paul's agenda at all. I think Paul was aware that he could create little clusters or cells of assemblies of Jesus followers around the empire, and they may grow a bit and that sort of thing. But I don't think he would have envisaged. I mean, if we sit down with Paul and you told him about the conversion of Constantine, he would have been like, "Oh wow, didn't see that one coming," but well, good for him. I mean, So yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've gone through the questions. So thank you very much for listening. More coming at 2 o'clock, I believe.